Che bello vedere da qua, è la prima volta che vedo da qua. Saluti a tutti. Per cominciare una piccola nota organizzativa. Presenterò brevissimamente il nostro ospite d'onore e lo farò in inglese, non per adeguarmi alla moda delle università milanesi, ma perché mi sembra educato, così ci capisce meglio, sono certo lo capirete anche tutti voi. Poi mi siedo con voi ad ascoltarlo e sono molto contento anch'io. Poi chiamerò gli ospiti della tavola rotonda, che sono tutte persone che hanno molte cose da dire, e avremo un po' di tempo per discutere, in questo caso in italiano, e poi ci salutiamo tutti. Questo è un po' lo schema della giornata. Here we go. In English, everybody understands, and so you can take your earphones off. And I'm going to introduce you a man that we all heard and read and is finally here. I believe that he can be labeled as a real intellectual powerhouse. It's one of the rare intellectuals, I believe, that had an impact, a serious impact on politics. Of course, I have no time, and you want to hear him, not me, to go into details. But just bear in mind, for those of you who don't know him well, that he's the one, probably the first person to say the GDP was a crude measurement of well-being in societies, and he helped the UN to develop what is now a classic, which is the Human Development Index. He's been active on mostly 4 domains: social choice theory, welfare economics, economic measurement, and development economics. And also, because we are on campus, we are within one of the big and most important university in Milan, in Italy, in Europe, is a man who is very comfortable on campus. Actually, he was born on campus, in a small campus, am I right, in the north of Kolkata, founded years before by Tagore. It's not a coincidence, maybe, that not only he won the Nobel Prize for Economics, someone said that if he tried, he could also have won Nobel Prize in Philosophy. And his father was a professor in Dhaka, and he's been teaching at the London School of Economics, Oxford, until 2004, if I'm right. He was at Trinity College, Cambridge. He's now professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard University. It's quite impressive. And hear this, I love that. Looking him up and reading, I worked out that he had 53 honorary degrees, 53. And then I looked some other measure, and it was 90. And because we were sitting next to each other, and I say, Professor Sen, 90, is that the right number? And he said, no, actually it's more than 100 now. And he said, hear these, next week I'm going to collect 3 honorary degrees. So for those of you who are fighting for the laurea, the first and only laurea in your life, you have someone here. And I'm very happy to welcome here someone who's got more than 100 honorary degrees. And he said, they don't mean much. And I said, some of the time, it is true. They don't mean much, but I'm sure that in your case, this is not the best definition of this man, which I found in an old Guardian profile, was his brain works like a searchlight. It's a great definition of anybody. I think everybody in this room will love someone to tell about him or her. His brain works like a searchlight. Too often, people in power in this country, and not only, their mind work as sort of a nightclub abat-jour or candlelight dinner table. So welcome, a searchlight, Professor Amartya Sen. Welcome.
It's a wonderful privilege for me to be here. Many of the people here I know from earlier days and have come to Bocconi also previously. And it's really a wonderful combination since my morning begins with Illy coffee. And in my case, it lasts until quite late in the evening. In my wife's case, it stops at lunchtime under some medical theory that she won't be able to sleep otherwise. And but the combination of the delights of pleasure and enjoyment of one of the vital aspects of living, namely coffee, with intellectual leadership that Bocconi represents, as Mr. Seveneni described, it's one of the leading universities in the world. And I think that's a great combination, and I'm really very pleased to be part of this discussion today. I would like to thank, of course, Mr. Seveneni for his over-generous, but I won't protest about that, kindness in introducing me. And I also enjoyed Mr. Perini's presentation. I should have explained that even though I've often worked on measurement, the most recently was on the invitation of someone who lost office last week, namely Sarkozy, Joe Stiglitz and myself and a few others, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi, we worked on measurement problem, how to measure things, rather similar to the ones that Mr. Perini was discussing. There's a report on that, by the way, which you might be interested in looking at. My talk today, however, is not going to be at all on measurement. It's going to be on policy. And it is about I called it technically the formal title is this economic system we need, but there's a more frivolous title, which I will also presently go into. But it's really concerned with a policy problem, and I think that's afflicting Europe badly now. And I have to say, even though I think these different measures do make a difference, and as Mr. Perrini rightly brought out that there are different ways of looking at the problem, I think most of these measures will indicate that things have gone pretty badly wrong in Europe. The question is why? So it's that question that I'm addressing. The frivolous title of the talk is called Snakes and Ladders of Europe. Now, Snakes and Ladders is an old Indian game. I think it's interesting that Indian history may be full of various things, including some mathematics, some religion, some philosophy, some astronomy. But I think it's almost unparalleled in inventing games. People seem to spend most of their time doing that. The most well-known of them, of course, is chess, which has become world famous. But the one I'm talking about is called Snakes and Ladders. And that was invented about 1,300 years ago in India. And I'll read my text because it's easier for the translator, I'm told. But I'll explain what the game is. So the game of snakes and ladders has been known in every part of India. But the game spread across the world and achieved global popularity through the British Empire. In playing the game, you try to progress as quickly as you can from the bottom of the board to its top. There, step by step you go. You throw a dice. If you get 5, then you get 5 steps. If you get 3, you get 3 steps, and so on. But in between, there are some snakes that come down and ladders that they go up. So if you hit the bottom of a ladder, you go straight up to the top of it, skipping many intermediate squares. And if you hit the mouth of a snake, then you come to the tail of it, down. nullifying some of the gains that you might have met. I think that's a very good analogy, I think, in the context of thinking what's happening in Europe today. I do believe, and this is, I'm afraid, going to be a very critical paper, that Europe is coming rapidly down a sequence of snakes right now. And what is urgently needed is to move from the snakes to the ladders. Today's discussion is concerned with, well, my paper in particular, finding ways and means of overcoming the adversities and also establishing the firm basis of new progress. In order to achieve this, we need a clear diagnosis of the snakes that we face and the ladders that are potentially available. All the distinctions that Mr. Perini are drawing are very important. Tomorrow, actually, I'm giving a talk in Bologna, which is concerned primarily with sustainability. But, and that remains a big issue, of course. That's one subject on which I think Europe's record is much better than, say, America's, which is not the case in management of economic crisis, for example. So it really depends on the focus. But in terms of the crisis, how it affected human people's lives, I think Mr. Perini and I, if we were to sit down, we would agree that no matter which of these indicators, there are signs of real distress which we have to address. And I feel moved by it because it's a kind of thing that I didn't really expect. I'm going off the script here. I mean, Europe has not only seen better days, it has been the glory of the world. This is, after all, where the European Enlightenment was born, the Industrial Revolution began, democracy, the idea has occurred everywhere in the world, but it's in Europe that the practice of democracy became standard and formalized. It's here that the welfare state was born after the Second World War. It's here that the idea of uniting people in a democratic form was born. I remind people, since I feel this is sometimes neglected, there's so much rhetoric about European unity, overlooking that right from the Ventotene Declaration in 1941 to the Milan Declaration of 43, it is not a call only for unity, it's a call for a united democratic Europe. I think extraordinarily important, that distinction. I believe the foundational problem in the European malaise is the replacement of the democratic commitment of Europe by leaving the people out of public discussion and relying instead on the financial pressures coming from a localized leadership of the European Union and the European Central Bank, and indirectly from the rating agencies across the world who influentially communicate their reading of the financial position of countries, and thereby having a tremendous impact on the financial market, particularly bond market, and making it impossible for the countries to ignore it. It could have been only through a united political leadership, but when the basic European financial wisdom leads one in a certain direction, and here Germany has had a strong voice, and I believe a parochial voice in a global world, I think this has done an enormous amount of harm in having an adequately broad view of the challenge that the world faces today. Avoidance of parochialism and making good use of public reasoning are central to solving many of the most difficult problems in the world today. And the need is particularly strong in Europe right now, though it applies even to the United States in a somewhat different way. This challenge applies specifically to the urgency of the economic crisis that is being faced in the world, but in Europe particularly. And with that, I would be mainly concerned here. So what about the economic crisis that Europe is facing today? I cannot hide the fact that I do strongly believe that many countries in the West in general, and in Europe in particular, seem to have been doing their best to go straight into the mouths of fairly hefty snakes. I come back to the snakes and ladders and going straight down. In an economic world that is still emerging very slowly from the gigantic crisis of 2008, with the continuation of huge unemployment, very low growth, and languishing demand, as is the case in many of the traditionally rich countries, particularly in the bulk of Europe, it's hard to think that anything can be further from an uplifting ladder and as close to a snake as a huge program of comprehensive and indiscriminate economic austerity. This is not to deny that some countries in Europe need, and indeed have needed for some time, a better system of economic accountability and more responsible financial management of the economy. I think before my friend Mario Monti became Prime Minister, I remember one occasion he made, I think it was an article in the Financial Times, that one of the great harms in Europe has been the culture of being polite to each other. So you didn't criticize, didn't criticize the Greek way of running things, for example, and there is a lot to criticize there. Not every country in crisis had this problem. Spain, for example, has been very different in this respect. Ireland has followed a kind of copybook, good behavior thing, and they have too come down with a crisis connected with austerity. So the austerity problem is very generic. On the other hand, the problem of particular reform are very strong in many areas, and I'm not at all taking the view that these countries do not need the reform, they do. But good economics is not just a matter of knowing what to do, it's also deciding what to do when. And the idea that you can cut down deficit in a period when your growth is slowing down for Greece went down from 3% to 2% to 0% to -5%, and for a while touching -7%. I don't know of any country in the history of the world which has been able to reduce its deficit when everything is collapsing. I think one of the most successful cases of cutting down public deficit is Sweden. That happened in the 1990s, but that happened in a period of economic growth. I mean, that's a very elementary economic understanding of how the thing proceeds, and if one does not seize that, one would be in great difficulty. This does not in any way dispute that many countries would need enormous reform, and including Italy, a lot of reform. The question is how to sequence it. When in the very early days of dynamic investment programming, which I was involved in for many years ago, like 50 years ago actually, nostalgic for me to think of those days, there were two kinds of problems, the choice problem and the sequencing problem. And this is an enormously important question of sequencing that we have to look at. I think in this context, I would like to distinguish between two separate issues. The first issue, and these are both issues of what I believe have been mistaken policies, dominantly mistaken policies in Europe. The first issue concerns the place of democratic priorities, including what Walter Bagehot and John Stuart Mill in particular saw as the need for, this is how Mill defined democracy, quote unquote, government by discussion. Suppose we accept, it's difficult for me to accept it, but let me, for the sake of argument, accept it, that the powerful financial bosses do have a good understanding of what needs to be done in Europe. This would certainly, if this were true, I don't believe it is, but assuming it to be true, this would certainly strengthen powerfully the case for paying attention to their voices in a democratic dialogue. But that is not the same thing as allowing the international financial institutions and rating agencies the power to call the shots, commanding democratically elected leaders of government whether of Greece, of Spain, or Portugal, or Ireland, to carry out a list of drastically specified orders coming from elsewhere. That seems to me almost everything that Europe traditionally stood for. It's a denial of that. That in itself is worrying for me, because politics is important, democracy is important. You know, wars have been fought in this continent, where democracy was one of the big causes. That certainly was one of the central features in the Second World War. And there were fights about democracy, even in very adverse circumstances, in the resistance and other things in Italy, a long history of that. So this is itself important. As it happened, it also has a very important role in preventing policies from going badly wrong. This was the point that John Stuart Mill was saying, that very clever people would sometimes get things wrong. And nevertheless, you don't say that they're not right. You have to criticize it. The idea that you can simply order countries without the population being brought into a public discussion seems to be not only anti-democratic, it's basically anti-intellectual. You need discussion on every subject. And it's through discussion, through public reasoning, that we could be sure it's right. Some of the people I disagree with here are among the people I count as friends and admire them. For example, I greatly admire Trichet, who ran the European Central Bank. I didn't agree with his policy for a second, but it isn't. I mean, I think extremely clever people are capable of making mistakes. You have to think about the history of ancient Greece. I'm sorry, I'm going away from this text. Who were the people who were trying to square the circles? They were the highest intellectuals in ancient Greece. The fact that they were the highest intellectuals did not mean their exercise, a good exercise to perform. We can all make mistakes. The way we avoid making mistakes, and I think here I would agree with people on the other side, because they would, I think, in principle agree, that the only way to do it is to discuss, is to argue, to criticize each other and see which way the argument takes us. So the second point, aside from the loss of democracy, is that it's quite hard to see that the exact sacrifices that the financial commanders have been demanding from the precariously placed countries in Europe, particularly Southern Europe, would ultimately deliver the economic viability of these countries, or even guarantee the long-run continuation of the euro with an unreformed system of financial amalgamation. The demanded fidelity to the draconian financial requirements has already undermined the popularity of a number of leaders of European governments and have led to the downfall of some of them. It's not by any means clear that even if these requirements are fully met, that the precariously placed countries would manage to have their financial houses in shape without use of exchange rate adjustment and without any respite from the highly restrictive monetary and fiscal policy of austerity that clearly have the effect of undermining economic growth comprehensively. It's not sufficient to say we are pro-growth. We have to say what is the mechanism through which you are generating economic growth. And you see here, for Professor Perini and myself, since we look for an indicator, even GDP works very well, even though it's not a very good indicator. Look at GDP growth, it will tell you something. The ways and means of generating private incomes and public revenues have to be radically re-examined. Now, turning to the rating agencies, they do, of course, have faith in their own reading of the economics and the financial understanding of the situation. But it is worth remembering today that the record of the rating agencies in certifying positively financial and business institutions preceding the 2008 economic crisis was so terrible that the United States Congress had to have serious debates on whether or not these rating agencies should be prosecuted. Now the same agencies have risen like the phoenix from the ashes and can tell democratic leaders of one country or another in Europe what they simply, quote unquote, must do, or else further downgrading of their credit rating entirely within the power of these rating agencies would absolutely ruin them. There are, of course, issues of financial responsibility and accountability in making use of large government expenditure. And I go on emphasizing because I don't want my speech to be misunderstood. There clearly has been systematic violation of responsible action in many countries in Europe, including Greece, but others too, and possibly in this country as well. But to move from that frying pan of mismanagement to the fire of indiscriminate cuts to satisfy the creditors and to placate the rating agencies with their simple-minded theories of sound finance, and to satisfy the financial leadership of Europe, which has a strong, universally sound, but I believe actually are based on a very parochial reading of what is needed. This has not been helping these countries to move into a responsible, forward-looking recovery program, and indeed to carry out these reforms that are needed effectively. Europe could not have got into this terrible crisis without some serious confusion of economic thinking at the top. But even with the confused thinking of the European economic leadership, Europe would not have been forced to face such a crisis but for the decision of the centralized leadership of Europe to impose its parochial view of salvation through ill-timed austerity without public dialogue with the people of the various countries which were simply asked to obey central orders. There's some irony in the fact that this denial of democratic consultation was sometimes imposed most firmly on countries that had historically played pioneering parts in the evolution of democracy in the world. So that's one snake. A second snake that has devoured much of Europe over a couple of decades now is, of course, the decision to have a monetary union without a fiscal union and without much further progress on a political union. I do emphasize again, since I was privileged to know Altiero Spinelli well, that the vision of a European movement was all a democratic Europe. There was a political union. There's a fiscal. The idea that it's a bankers' unity led by the bankers is not what they were signing petitions, signing declaration on in 42 or 43, in 41 or 42 or 43 in Milan or Ventotene or anywhere else. The oddity of going for a united currency, the euro, without more political and economic integration has certainly played a substantial part in causing and intensifying this crisis, even after taking note of financial transgression that have undoubtedly been committed in the past in countries like Greece and Portugal and even Italy. It's no consolation for me to recollect that right from the beginning, from the early 90s when the euro came in, I have been personally entirely opposed to the euro, and for reasons that have been confirmed by the recent turmoil. It's no consolation because I would have liked to have been proven wrong. As it turned out that my worst fears not only came true, they were turned out to be even worse than what I feared. I'm very strongly in favor of European unity in general. There's nothing as important as that. One of the great things to emerge after the Second World War, the European unity. But it is a democratic unity that was being sought, not a monetary union, shorn of political union, shorn of fiscal responsibility towards each other. My worry about the euro was partly concerned with each country's giving up freedom of monetary policy and of exchange rate adjustment, and which have helped in the past countries to get out of difficulty. I think many of these countries would have got out of difficulty. You know, maybe one thing is worth remembering, that Greece, for example, had a huge lot of mismanagement and corruption and others. But it wasn't facing a crisis before 2008. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't need reform. It did need reform. But the present level of crisis that we have is connected entirely with the beginning of the crisis and the way the crisis have been handled in Europe in general. And it's something where America could even go to, because there's a real difference between the two political parties. Even the fairly modest attempt at stimulus by Obama is very hard to get through in Congress, because a lot of people think in exactly the same way the European do. I think it's a parochial view, but parochial views could be quite popular, as Adam Smith discussed in his first book, published in 1759, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that a kind of parochial approach may become so widely accepted. He talked about infanticide, the fact that everywhere in ancient Greece they believed that unless you allow infanticide, no country will remain viable. Now, there is a kind of misunderstanding there, and there's parochialism there. Oddly enough, there were countries even at the time which did not allow infanticide. I'm proud to say that under Buddhist rule in India, that would have been unthinkable as being a permissible thing. So it existed even at that time, but the Greeks were not particularly aware of what was going on elsewhere in the world. Well, they were at some level, but not in this level. So Smith discusses it. It's, by the way, a very good book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. I'll come back to the other book, The Wealth of Nations, in a few minutes, but I do recommend those who are philosophically inclined to read that book. Now, what has happened, the European, they're having the euro, I believe, was a mistake, but it's happened. What, as the English say, it's water under the bridge. We have to accept it. You can't change it. In particular, you can't go up a snake. You have to look for a ladder. You can't just undo what you have done, because time has a certain direction. So you have to see how to approach the problem. I'll come to that at the end. I think any solution to the euro problem has to come slowly, in my judgment. First, with definitely including short-run bailing out, followed by long-run economic rearrangement, and all this would demand enormously more public reasoning about what is feasible, what makes economic sense, and what is ethically and politically acceptable in a democratic dialogue. This must begin with some immediate restraining of the unilateral power of financial top dogs of the present economic leadership of Europe, which has so severely marginalized, I believe, European democracy. In addition to the problems created by the euro and the European mismanagement and marginalization of democratic decision-making, there is, of course, the problem, and we have to note that, of the continuing global recession, which began first in America and then engulfed the world, including Europe. The world did have a gigantic economic crisis that erupted in late 2008. And in the months that followed, the hurricane gathered strength. In the USA, where the crisis has its initial base, and in Europe, which moved down in unison with America, the hurricane devastated employment, production, human security, and the solvency of a great many individuals and a number of states. The crisis was moving towards a global meltdown when the first attempts at defensive resistance came, most prominently through the meeting of G20 leaders in London in April 2009, led by Gordon Brown, which was a sagacious and momentous initiative of global public reasoning. The general prospect of bottomless freefall was indeed halted by the actions taken then. However, the crisis was too deep-rooted to go away rapidly. Europe, which had a less good record in general than the USA in the field of employment, darkened the record quite a bit more. And the USA, too, lost its high employment shine and began to rival Europe in massive unemployment. Though not quite like that, not waiting to a situation where nearly 50% of young Greeks or young Spaniards may not have any job to go to. The kind of impact it has on the nature of an economy is devastating. People forget. We forget how much of the European culture is built on the Industrial Revolution discipline, which take you away from life of a peasant economy, and where there is a regularity connected with jobs and employment and industrial operation. And if 50% of the young never get into a job, I mean, there is a real pedagogic failure there, because training and work is also a form of education, not just what happens at Bocconi and Harvard and Cambridge and Oxford. Now there's something of a recovery going on across the world, and there are stirrings in that direction in the USA too. But the recuperation has been weak, and what we are left with are not merely scars of past injury, but active wounds that are still unhealed. Nevertheless, I would argue that what we are suffering from today are mainly the consequences of inadequacy of the policy response to the crisis, rather than an inevitable aftermath of the crisis itself. The attempts at recovery have been, by and large, very feeble, though there are enormous international variations in the quality and robustness of the recession policies, anti-recession policies across the world. Despite the variations, the weakness of the response, particularly in Europe and America, has not only affected the vigor of the recovery in the West, but also in the rest of the world, especially affecting those economies, for example, many in Africa, that are more vulnerable and more dependent on market demand from coming from Europe and America than are other developing economies such as China or Brazil or India, which had been far less affected. So where do we go from here? And what are the ladders? As I mentioned, we cannot get up a snake to undo what has been done. Europe has to avoid hitting new snakes. Through its combination, I think Europe has a kind of really unfortunate combination of authoritarian politics on one side with unclear economic thinking. And when parochial economic thinking becomes the forceful approach to authoritarian politics, you really have a potential of coming down a lot more snakes than we already have. I think attempt to keep economies like Greece and Spain in float in the present thing without changing the basic policies may continue, so that when they ultimately go, if they do, there will be massively more debt to pay than even today. So we have to avoid further snakes. That's certainly right. But the thing to recognize on the latter is that there's plenty of evidence that the best way of cutting deficits is to have economic growth. And economic growth even of GDP, no matter what you think of GDP. There's the huge deficits, we have to remember, after the Second World War, quickly disappeared with fast economic growth that the world experienced after the war ended. So did the big United States deficit during the 8 years of Bill Clinton's presidency, mainly because there was economic growth, and fast. There's surely some lessons here, still from Keynes, who should not have been such a stranger to the economic leadership of Europe as a very good European himself. However, Keynes cannot be our savior, or can be only to a limited extent. And there is need to look beyond him to have a solid foundation for a new economic system, including taking into account all those considerations that Professor Perini was presenting earlier, broadening it. Because none of these, by the way, would have interested Keynes at all, as far as I can see. Keynes was moved, and I'm impressed by that, by the plight of the unemployed. Many years ago, when I had the opportunity of giving the first Buffy lecture in the Banca d'Italia, I remember reading Mr. Buffy's own reflections as he arrived in London and saw the unemployed walk down the street and how his reactions were. And I made that the beginning point of my lecture. And Keynes had that particular sympathy. Buffy had a lot more, I believe. But what Keynes did not have is interest much in inequality, in poverty, or for that matter, in sustainability. I think Professor Perini would have passed him by completely because he wasn't interested in that. And we had to be interested in that. Oddly enough, the earliest of economic thinkers, Adam Smith, was interested in all of them. Inequality, poverty. There's a lovely statement that Smith makes in The Wealth of Nations that, discussing whether the state ruins things, he said, intervention by the state in the interests of the poor and the employees, workers, are almost invariably produce good result. But intervention in the interest of the rich often doesn't. And his complaint was that because of the political power, most of the interventions were in the interest of the rich rather than of the poor. That's why he appeared to be so comprehensively against intervention, which is not his position because he took a very balanced view. So I think we can look at Smith, and I will come to a statement of his presently. But a number of other economists have taken a lot of interest in these issues, like sustainability, poverty, inequality, the other malaise that modern society suffers from, which includes A.C. Pigou, who is thought to be an opponent of Keynes. Certainly, he took a different view of employment, but he wrote the first measure of inequality. He was concerned with poverty. Unlike Keynes, he defined economics not as Lionel Robbins has done, but as he put it, the beginning of economics is in the mean streets and the hallowed human lives. There's a lot of good sense from Paul Samuelson, from Kenneth Arrow. I always find this distinction between neoclassical and anti-neoclassical to be basically unproductive, because Keynes is very anti-neoclassical with very little sympathy, unlike these neoclassical economists like Pigou or Smith, actually Smith too, but Pigou, I meant to say Pigou or Samuelson and Arrow. They were discussing externalities, they were discussing public goods, they were discussing asymmetric information as to why the market economy cannot fully take care of healthcare ever. That was a discussion by Kenneth Arrow in the early 1970s. So I think there's a lot to learn, and I don't have enough time to go into them, but I just wanted to mention that here. The neglect of Keynesian thought today in seeing the constructive role of state-based support to the market economy and through that to economic growth has been, I believe, costly for Europe, including in Keynes's own native Britain, where it was voluntarily chosen rather than imposed by the leadership of Europe. I find it very difficult to say why it was chosen. And all this does need remedying, and we do need Keynes, but we need a lot more than Keynes. We have to look well beyond Keynes to decide what kind of an economic system Europe needs. While Keynes pointed out powerfully to the complementarity of the markets and the state. By the way, this is the point which I must linger for 1 second here. People forget, very poor market people, government has a huge deficit. Now they forget two things. Many of the countries have huge deficits because the market economy got into a total mess, and then the state had to bail them out. It did not begin with a government failure, it began with a market failure. And secondly, today, if you suddenly decide to cut the deficit by cutting the government, you're cutting the market as well. Because the market, as Smith noted, market and the state operate in the same space. You can't cut the state and keep the market economy booming, which is the problem of the present wishfulness in wanting economic growth while you continue with austerity. There have been plenty of constructive European analysis arguing for non-market operations led by the state or by cooperative efforts of other kinds to reach the lives of people who may not get enough support from the market economy in itself. The welfare state evolved in Europe, and its intellectual roots go back not only to early socialist thought in this continent, but also to the socially enlightened ideas of humane political leaders, such as Bismarck. I had said in a paper in New York Review that Bismarck had more to say on social welfare than Keynes had, and all my friends in Banca d'Italia rose like one man to protest against it and wrote to me saying, immediately take it back. But I stick to it. I think Bismarck had more to say on that than Keynes had. Keynes had one big thing to say, that's employment and the interdependence of the market and the state. But Europe needs a lot more than that. It is this broad understanding of the interactive role of the market and the state that Adam Smith had advanced in his pioneering work that effectively founded modern economics. And there is a case for going back to that, The Wealth of Nations, which was supplementing his deeply philosophical work. Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. Deeply philosophical work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith identified why it is important to have a flourishing market economy. And going beyond that, why we need good global political economy. And here I quote from Smith. We need this because of two distinct objects. I'm quoting Smith here. First, to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves. This is what a flourishing market economy does. I'm adding that. And continuing with Smith. And secondly, this is Smith, to supply the state or the Commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services it has to perform. There isn't a sense of hostility between the market and the state here. In the pioneering defender of the market economy, namely Smith. He was defending the market partly because it makes people prosperous, partly because it generates revenue for the state so that it can do public services. And the public services today, in addition to healthcare, education, and everything else, would also include paying back debt. And so the whole picture of that interdependence and with a broad objective is very worth bearing in mind today. When Smith championed the crucial role of public reasoning within and across the borders of the nation state, he was very strongly opposed to parochial thinking, especially when parochial thinking is imposed in an authoritarian way. Smith focused on humane and enlightened reasoning, which can make us understand what needs to be done. This, I fear, is a far cry from the dominance of an allegedly superior economic thinking coming from the central financial powers of Europe, imposing a dogmatic and also ultimately parochial vision on the entire continent with impact on the entire world. The economic system we need must involve both broad-minded economics and capacious democratic politics in the million form of government by discussion. Thank you.
There.
I better
Central
pick
one.
up my thing.
I will speak English.
Oh, you speak it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just 2 or 3 questions, because it was a fascinating lecture, and some of them, at least a couple of them about you, because I think people here want to know a bit more about you. But first of all, let me ask you a snake question, because it's a difficult one to ask. In Bocconi, where our current Prime Minister was for many, many years the president, coming from a columnist for Corriere della Sera, where Mario Monti has been writing for 30 years, and asking it in Italy. The snake question is this. You mentioned, and I noticed that quite a few people took note, including Vice President Bonino, she noticed this, so I noticed she wrote it down, that the word, what happened, you know, all these attempt to overcome the crisis severely marginalized European democracy. I'm quoting you. Would you consider what happened in Italy, that means an unusual government, initially labeled as a technocratic government, although with a big parliamentary majority, also something that is not perfect, it's not marginalizing. I was at Oxford a few months ago, and a good friend of mine, John Lloyd, you probably know him, he used the expression gentle coup for what happened in Italy. And I said, no, I don't think it's fair.
What was he referring to? Which was the coup?
Oh, the fact that there was a technocratic government in Italy which had to take care of the mess we were sort of plunged into.
Yeah. You know, I think that's a very interesting and deep question. I've been very involved with it in Italy, and I can very slowly read newspapers like Corriere della Repubblica with a dictionary in hand, though I can't talk very easily in Italian. I think Italy is an extraordinarily important country, of course, and in the history of democracy, just as ancient Greece is very important, the history of the city-states after 1000 AD in Italy was, of course, that was tweaking the boundaries of democracy. But that always went with a system. There's not just the election. There is debate for ancient Greece, that was a big thing, of course. There's also different layers of power. In the Italian context today, there is, of course, a parliament. There's also a president, with, in this case, not entirely without power. And I think a system, which, I mean, in the case of United Kingdom, it's quite different because of, you know, generally not wanting monarchy to play a role. You can't, the monarch cannot play a part that the Italian president can. I'm also speaking of someone I happen to know very well, since one of my principal teachers was Piero Sciappa. So through him, of course, I came to know Giorgio Napolitano a long time ago. And I think he was first of all very wise, but also part of the government. So I think what happened here was that I never quite understood how the elections come out the way they do in Italy. Because I go around, I never meet someone who has voted for the party which wins. So I don't know what exactly happened. And I don't believe there's any fraud in that. It may be that people don't like saying who they were voted for. It could be the wrong class. I think Karl Marx would have been very upset if I told him that the only people who said that they voted for Mr. Berlusconi, I'm not making any comment about him personally, but his party, the only people I encountered who said, oh yes, we proudly voted for him, were the two persons who used to clean our room in the hotel. And in terms of the class structure that Marx was concerned with, I think this would have worried him greatly, that I mix with intellectuals like here, and then we get a different answer. I don't know what your personal view on that is. So I think, I don't quite know how it happened. But, you know, part of the democratic system is to anticipate that could happen, particularly when public reasoning, which seems at one level very vigorous, but at another level it may not be quite so vigorous, doesn't produce the result. I mean, that is why there are different layers. That is why there's a presidency. You know, Indian system is somewhat similar. It's only in an emergency that the Indian president has a power. But, you know, I hope we won't get there. We have to judge a political system. So I wouldn't say that the Italians were the failure of democracy. And nor would I say the arrival of a technocratic government was in itself a mistake, because after all, the government was in a state of non-viability at that state. Now, part of the non-viability, of course, arose precisely from what I've been discussing. And the creating credit rating agencies were also going against Italy very badly. So that contributed, undoubtedly. But there was also the question about what were the steps that are being taken. So those who were opposed to that view, they also didn't see what were being done to achieve high economic growth. I've always thought that Italy needed a lot of reform. And I may be described as, despite my generally left-wing views, may be described as right-wing in thinking that I think the pension age needed reform. A lot of things that needed reform, any country does. And I think at the time when the Mario Monti government came in, it was a very good decision to happen. There is now a question about what kind of policies would it be pursuing. And Mario Monti, I have not known him intimately, but I've known him for many, many years. Visited him, I think I first met him when he came for my first Buffy lecture. And he made a very illuminating comment on my lecture. So I value him. But, you know, I don't take the view that intelligent people would necessarily make the right decision in the absence of public discussion. What it is an invitation to is to you, namely the media. Namely that if you think that this is not the right thing, you ought to tell the technocratic government why isn't it right. So I think it's public engagement that I'm looking for. And rather than saying, going into the rather esoteric question, like how many angels can dance on the head of a needle, I think we have to go into the question of how we can bring more forceful, more informed public discussion to the attention of those who are doing the governance. But because it may be technocratic, but they're not people who don't read newspapers and see what's being discussed and what are arguments presented. They may not be influenced by a vote, but they will be influenced by arguments. And that's also one of the merits of a democratic government. I know of other countries which have had that. I mean, once or twice, I can give other examples. Happily, we haven't quite, in India, we haven't had that problem, even though the government has changed many times. So that's the way around.
Thank you.
You might think that I avoided the question.
2 more quick questions.
Yeah.
First of all, I do think that we badly needed, personally, this government. Actually, in the FT, I call it Mario Poppins Monti, like a magical babysitter that came to Italy. We desperately need him. Of course, his children will have to grow up, and Mary Poppins he'll fly away. But we need him for the time being. You like Mario Poppins Monti? And it's so nice to say it here. Just 2 more questions because we have a...
And by the way, I want to make it clear, you said it, I didn't. Okay.
No, I did. No, but you asked me. I do think we did need Mario Poppins Monti in Italy, by all means. Quick question, you mentioned India. I'm happy with the short answer. There is something quintessentially Indian that is still in you as a thinker, as a person that never left you.
I don't know what language may be. The poetry I most enjoy reading is Bengali poetry. I like listening to Indian music. In terms of thinking, you know, I have a book called Identity and Violence, which was actually presented in Italian by La Terza. I argue that actually, if you compare the ancient Indian debates, they're very like the ancient Greek debates. I don't believe that division between, say, India and Europe works like that way. The way it's divided is basically a kind of racial distinction, whereby ancient Greeks' democratic tradition is an inheritance also of Vikings and Goths and Visigoths, whereas it's not a part of the tradition of countries with which ancient Greeks like chatting, like Egyptians, Indians, Iranians, Bactrians. So I think I've never really felt that division between Indian thinking and other thinking.
Good.
I think Indian mathematics was exactly similar. It began on its own. It got a huge fillip when the Greek mathematics arrived. Indian theater was completely transformed in that period. We're talking about more than 2,000 years ago. And they have interacted. I mean, we accept things from other countries extremely easily. They become part of our identity. Can I tell you a story?
I love to hear the story, but we have a great round table coming up, so I don't want to be a journalist, let's say. I don't want to be a journalist. A short story, great.
Yeah, it's not a novel. It's a story about mathematics. If you take the trigonometric term sine, you know, like sine, cosine, tangent, what's the origin of it? Now, when Aryabhata, an Indian mathematician, first uses the concept of sine, he gives it a Sanskrit name, Artha or Jya Artha. Now, Jya, when the Arabs translate Jya from Sanskrit to Arabic, they call it Jiba. Arabic being written with consonant like Hebrew, there's no vowel, it's JV. So the later generation of Arabs, instead of calling it Jiba, they went on, because Jiba means nothing in Arabic. They changed it to Jab. Jab is a very good word, which means a cove or a bay. So they went on referring to it as Jab. Now, when Gerardo of Cremona in 1150 first translates this trigonometry book from Arabic to Latin, he uses the word Jave instead of Jave, translates it as sinus, as a cove or a bay. And from that, the word sine today comes. So in that one word, you capture a culture that is connected with Europe, Italy, Latin, Arabic, Sanskrit, Indian. And if we don't run out of time, I could have included the Chinese too, but I won't.
Just a final, there are a lot of young people here. There are a lot of young people. So why don't we, as a sort of farewell by Amartya Sen, you have to tell them, of course, study hard, know what you're doing and whatever, but no study hard. Well, okay, so just give them one bit of advice, just one to the young people in this room from you. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it's valuable. You have 4 children, am I right?
I have.
Okay, so think, there are people in this room who that could be my children and our children, so let's tell them something useful. One thing, it's a tough time, they need advice.
I think the main thing I want to say is that they don't need advice, they ought to think. And I think from some of I've heard many advices in my life, and some of them have been very useful, and others have not. So I think, like everything else, you have to view advice critically. And some of them would be terrible. Don't do them.
It's a great.
And some of them would be very fine. So always listen, but don't accept until you have scrutinized it.
I think it's a great final line. So don't follow advice and be critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Questa vi do là. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.